All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Bro or Pro. Today, I triple barrel bluff, 9-8 suited, button versus small blind, and I get totally owned. So let's see if I played this hand like a bro or like a pro. Okay, table two, we open big blind, get called by the small blind. Flop this open ender with the back door. Go for a big bet on the flop. Okay, so in the video, I mentioned that I opened the big blind and get called by the small blind. Obviously, it doesn't really make sense. What really happened was I opened the button and small blind calls. So unfortunately, I don't really do any flatting out of the small blind in these positions, so I don't really have a good idea what the small blind's flatting range might be here. So I'm going to take my best shot at it, and I'm just going to sort of guess and insert a range in a pile that I think would be sort of reasonable for like what a fish would be flatting out of the small blind. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so what I did was just took my button flatting range facing under the gun open, and I just sort of sprinkled in like a bunch of random hands that maybe like a fish might be playing, might be flatting out of the small blind. I added a bunch of pocket pairs and added some suited hands. So hopefully this is a pretty accurate flatting range from the small blind, but it's really kind of a crapshoot, so it's hard to say. All right, now let's get the rest of the inputs put into Pio and let's see how we did. All right, I got the Pio output here, so I didn't give him the option to donk bet here, which I think is pretty standard. So villain checks his entire range, and here's our betting strategy. So it looks like on this board we're betting very selectively, especially when we're using the B75. We're betting 75% of the pot as our main bet sizing here, which is the only size I gave Pio the option because that's the sizing I would be using on this flop. Looking at our hand here, 9-8 suited is going to be one of our frequent bets, especially with hearts. Looks like we're meant to bet or check. We can bet 55-ish% of the time and check the remaining 45-ish% of the time. So nothing wrong with betting, nothing wrong with checking. They should both be about the same EV. So it looks like our flop play is going to be Pio approved. Let's just have a quick look at what his calling range should be here against our strategy when we bet big on the flop. Looks like he should be check raising pretty infrequently, right? Jacks, Jack 10, King Queen be like the main driver, the main check raises that he has here. But in general, he's not check raising very often. He's starting to fold like a bunch of pocket pairs lower than 10. Makes a lot of sense, right? He's calling some straight draws. He's calling some 10x, calling Jack X. All this makes sense. Calling sets, sometimes raising sets. Ace 3 suited gets called. Everything looks pretty natural here. I guess like Ace Queen, he's floating even without a backdoor flush draw, which is pretty interesting. Ace Queen off, he's floating. So he's actually meant to call us pretty light as far as Ace High goes, which is interesting, right? Because if you look at this, like, I guess like his absolute hand strength hands, like nines is obviously absolutely stronger than Ace Queen off here, but Ace Queen off just has a lot more nut potential and a lot more, it can improve a lot easier, right? Like if he has nines and he's behind, he's just crushed. He's just two outs basically, right? Or runner straight draws. If he has Ace Queen and he's behind, I mean, a Queen's probably live, an Ace is probably live. He's got some nutted straight outs, right? He's got a King to the nuts. So it makes a lot of sense. Intuitively, it might not make sense when you first look at it, but once you think about it a little bit, it makes a bit more sense that he would be calling with some of these hands that at first glance are sort of a weaker hand strength than these pocket pairs that he is mostly folding. Cool, so he calls and let's go to the turn. He's condensed. I don't know if we really get to overbet here because our draw isn't very nutted. All right, so on the turn, we see the two of spades here. Again, he doesn't have a donk range, so I have him checking his full range. And in game, you hear me say, like, I don't know if we get to overbet here because our draw isn't very nutted. That's a really poor thought process to have. I think like the correct thought process should be like, what's my main sizing here on the turn? And like, I'm mainly going to be overbetting, right? None of my like the nuts didn't change on this turn card, right? It's pretty much a brick. And we still have like a massive nut advantage here. Like we have jacks, we have tens. He rarely has jacks and tens. We have aces, we have kings, we have ace jack. Like we have all the strongest hands on this board. So when we have like a monopoly on uniquely strong hands on the nuts, we are just going to be using overbets on the turn, especially when the doesn't change the nuts or doesn't really change the board, I guess would be a better way to put it. So my main bet sizing here is going to be an overbet. So if I look in Pio here, it makes sense, right? When we are betting, we're mostly overbetting. We're overbetting 40% of our range here, or we're big betting with 20% of our range. I think it's too hard to implement a 2-bet size strategy on a turn, so I'm going to simplify this to just overbet. Like in game, I'll just be using overbets in this spot. So what I could do is I could go back and rerun this with a subtree and only give it overbet here on the turn. But I think we're just gonna stick with it as it is. I don't think it'll affect the results all that much. So let's check out our hand here. So it does look like 9-8 suited. When we do bet, we are going to be overbetting. It does look like we are mostly checking with this hand. And I think the reason for that is something I mentioned in the video, which is our draw isn't super nutted. So usually if you are going to be overbetting, you want to be redrawing. If you're going to be overbetting like sort of draws as a bluff, if you hesitate to call this a bluff because we have so much equity, but when you're overbetting draws, you tend to want them to be like draws to the nuts. Whereas like here, if a queen comes, we don't have the nuts. Sure, it's like pretty rare he has king 9, and he like never has ace king. So we have near the nuts, but our draw just isn't that strong. But it doesn't look like it's a mistake to overbet. For instance, if we look at the EV of overbet versus check, checking is worth 32% of the pot and overbetting is worth 32% of the pot. So there's no EV loss for overbetting this hand. So it looks like we should only be overbetting it, what was it, 13% of the time? 15% of the time-ish. Here in game, I rolled the 13 in my RNG, which for me, low numbers are less aggressive actions. So like in order to overbet, I would need to roll like an 85 since I'm only overbetting 15% of the time. I hope that makes sense. So my frequency is way out of whack here. So I'm probably overdoing it with my frequency, but not an EV loss. So I don't mind my play here on the turn. So I think overbet is perfectly fine. So we overbet and let's see how villain's meant to react. Looks like he is meant to fold all the pocket pairs he did call with. He's meant to start folding gut shots. He's meant to start folding top pairs even. Top pairs with no flush draw. He's calling some queens, some tens, I mean. Interesting that he's calling queen 10 here, but he's folding like jack 9. I guess that must be some blocker effects. It looks like his main calls are going to be centered around top pairs. If he has queens, I don't know that villain really has queens here all that often, but his main calls are going to be centered around top pair, though he is mixing fold depending on the suit. So if you look here, he actually is folding ace jack when he has the ace of spades. And I think that's just because like a lot of our overbet bluffs are going to be nutted flush draws. So when he has the ace of spades, it makes it less likely that we're bluffing, right? Because we would be bluffing our nutted flush draws. He's blocking our nutted flush draw. So therefore, we're more likely to have value rather than a bluff because he's blocking our bluffs. But he's calling, same goes here with king jack of spades. Like if you notice, he's folding king jack about half the time here when he has the king of spades, and he's pure calling when he has like the king of hearts, king of diamonds, king of clubs. So that's just something interesting to note. Like facing big bets, you really want to be blocking. When someone's overbetting, their bluffs are going to tend towards like nutted bluffs. So for instance, like the nut flush draw would be overbetting more often than like a weak flush draw would be. And so if you're calling down with a pair, for instance, you're essentially bluff catching when you're calling an overbet here with top pair. So when you're calling down with a pair, you really want to be unblocking my bluffs. So having the king of spades and having the ace of spades is actually blocking a good chunk of my bluffs, which means I'm pushed towards value, which means he's going to have to start folding a bit more when he has those cards. So yeah, as we can see, and he's calling king queen suited when he has, of course, when he has the flush draw, he's open-ended with the flush draw. Makes a lot of sense. But he's even calling some just open-ended with no flush draw redraw. So that's pretty interesting. Queens are folding half the time. That's pretty crazy. Like I can't imagine people in the pool are folding queens 50% of the time to an overbet here. Like in fact, I mean, I'd be surprised if we get to this node with queens, but still pretty interesting to note. Looks like ace 10 has a bit of call. King 10 is calling sometimes. Yeah, I think ace 10 and king 10, it's mostly like they block king jack, which would be like a hand we'd be overbetting. It's interesting to see, like you see, we're calling with king 10 of hearts like 72% of the time, and or he is, I guess, and he's folding queens. Uh, he's calling queens like 60% of the time. So just another example of how absolute hand strength doesn't really factor. Like you're not just calling a linear range when you're facing these types of bets. You really want to think. You really want to take card removal into effect. Cool. So he does end up calling, and let's go to the river.
We're unblocking king queen, which is good. We're going for it here, boys. It's going to be the hand of the day.
And on the river, we see the 5 of hearts. Again, he doesn't have a donking range, so he checks his whole range over to me. And now it's up to us. Do we want to bluff this combo or do we not? So I think at this point, we're sort of at the bottom of our range, right? We certainly have no showdown value. It's pretty hard for us to have a worse hand than 9 high here. And in the video, you hear me say like we're unblocking king queen, which is like a huge part of his folding range, right? Like he has 16 combinations of king queen that would call flop, call turn, and then fold river. So that's actually fairly important. Like if we look here at my strategy, hands I'm meant to be bluffing with, like ace queen, king queen off, ace queen off, we're never bluffing these hands, and that's because we block so much of his folding range, right? Like his main folding range here is gonna be like hands like king queen. And maybe like some nut flush draws that contain a king and a queen in them. So, or an ace. So when we have those hands, we are not going to be bluffing. That's very important to mention. Also worth noting, like we're either shoving or folding, or shoving or checking. I'm sorry, we're either shoving or checking here. I think that makes a lot of sense. We've really polarized our range with the overbet on the turn. So there's not really any sizing that we would want to use after saying like, hey, we either have a nutted hand or we have an air ball. We get to the river, nothing's changed. The 5 of hearts is a complete brick. So again, we still either have a nutted hand or we have an air ball. So we're just going to want to bet as big as we can. So let's actually examine what his folding range here is when we do jam. So he is going to be folding. He's supposed to be folding queens 100% of the time, king, queen, ace, queen. So he should be calling with hands like ace, jack. Ace jack sometimes. Like he should be mixing fold with ace jack, mixing fold with king jack. Looks like suits matter quite a bit. Looks like he actually wants to have the ace of spades now and the king of spades. I think that's because, for the most part, we're going to be giving up our flush draws here on the river. So when he is the king of spades, like that means that we're not going to be bluffing when we have the ace of spades or the king of spades. So when he is the king of spades or the ace of spades, he's actually not blocking any bluffs. Importantly, he's actually unblocking some of our bluffs. So that's why he prefers, all of a sudden it sort of switches on the river where now he wants to have the king of spades or the ace of spades, rather than on the turn when he had king jack, he didn't, or ace jack, he didn't want to have the spade. And that's because he wants us to have the flush draw on the turn, so he doesn't want to block the flush draw. Then here on the river, we're not going to be bluffing flush draws, so he wants to block the flush draws since that's actually unblocking our bluffs. That may not make a ton of sense if you sort of sit down and think about it for a while. Hopefully it will. If not, leave a comment below and I can try to explain it. So looks like his main calling range here is going to be some top pairs, lots of top pairs. He's mixing fold, like king jack of spades is just folding 100% of the time. Ace jack's calling, jack 10. So 2 pairs, sets. So he's mostly calling 2 pairs and sets. He's mixing fold with some top pairs. And a lot of his folds are like king, queen. Look at all these folds that contain a queen and that contain a king. Like all of these hands here are folding quite a bit and they all contain a king and a queen. So that explains our strategy here. If we go back to our strategy, that's why we're checking king, queen, and ace, queen, and ace, queen. And that's because if we're bluffing with those hands, those are like the only hands he's folding at this point. So if we're jamming those hands, like if we have that hand, he's just more likely to have a hand he's going to call us down with. So let's see how we did with the 9-8 of hearts. Looks like it is 100% a pure jam. So it looks like we actually chose the right strategy here with this hand. And it looks like, yeah, like checking is worth a lot less than jamming. Jamming is worth about 8% of the pot. And this is a pretty big pot at this point, right? Like triple barrel bluff. Like we bet flop, bet turn. At this point, the pot's huge. So 8% of the pot is actually quite a bit. So very important to note. Checking here would actually be like a complete disaster. So we do follow through with the bet. Let's see what happens. Let's see what he ends up doing here.
I guess like how often is he folding a jack? This guy looks like a fish.
Oh my God, what the fuck? Oh man, and he totally owned us there with ace 10. So if we look, he's actually supposed to fold that hand 100% of the time, but hey, I guess props to him. He sniffed it out. I think really it's just a losing call, and I think he's probably just a weaker player. Like if you look at his stats there on the HUD, he's 42 VPIP and what is it, 12 PFR. So usually when there's a big gap between VPIP and PFR, you've identified a pretty weak player. And I think like exploitatively, maybe I should not try to bluff that guy, right? Like fish tend to call a little too often. Fish kind of hate folding. So once he calls the overbet on the turn, once a player of this player type calls an overbet on the turn, I suspect he's probably a little bit less likely to fold river. He sort of committed when he called the turn. That's kind of how they think sometimes, I guess. I don't know. Could be wrong about that one, but anyways, according to Pio here, looks like I actually took the pro line with this hand, but exploitatively maybe there's some EV to be made, making different decisions. Yeah, so let me know what you guys think. Do you think it was a mistake once he calls the overbet on the turn to continue on the river? Or do you think it's fine to just follow Pile here and play the hand sort of theoretically sound as Pile would play it? And we sort of just unfortunately ran into a guy who just stationed us a little bit. So let me know what you guys think. And feel free to leave a comment below and let me know if you guys enjoy these videos or how I can improve. This is only my second video in the series, so working hard at this. Hopefully I'll get better. Hope you guys enjoy. Cheers.